In the shadow of a crystal chandelier worth more than most people's homes, 12-year-old Harlan Clark sat imprisoned by his own birthday cake. The towering confection before him, a masterpiece of vanilla fondant and gold leaf that cost more than a teacher's monthly salary, might as well have been a monument to his isolation. 24 perfectly crafted candles flickered like tiny beacons of hope in a sea of indifference, their warm glow unable to penetrate the cold reality of his situation. Around him, the Clark estate hummed with the sound of success. Italian marble floors reflected the soft light from hand-blown Venetian glass fixtures, while Persian rugs worth small fortunes cushioned the steps of guests whose net worth could fund entire school districts. The air itself seemed expensive, perfumed with the scent of imported orchids and the subtle musk of old money. Yet, for all its grandeur, the massive ballroom felt suffocating. Harlan's fingers tightened around his most precious possession, a battered red toy car that had seen better days. Its once bright paint had faded to a dull crimson, chipped away by countless hours of nervous handling. The tiny vehicle's plastic wheels were worn smooth, just like the larger wheels of his own chair. Wheels that bore the scuff marks of a life lived differently than he'd planned. Those scuffs told a story he tried not to remember. The deep gouge on the left wheel from the day he'd tried to navigate the hospital corridor alone, desperate to prove he wasn't helpless. The scratches along the rim from the countless door frames he'd misjudged in those first terrible months after the accident. Each mark was a reminder of the moment everything changed. The screech of brakes, the sickening crunch of metal, the silence that followed. The Clark estate buzzed with $10,000 per plate conversations, yet nobody noticed the boy drowning in silence. "Magnificent spread, Donovan," came a voice from somewhere behind Harlan's left shoulder. He didn't turn to look. He'd learned that adults preferred talking over him rather than to him, as if his wheelchair somehow made him invisible. "The quarterly projections look stellar," another voice chimed in. "That Shanghai deal really paid off." Business. Always business. Even at his own birthday party, the conversation gravitated toward stock prices and market fluctuations. Harlan had grown used to being an afterthought in his father's empire, but on his birthday, the sting cut deeper. A group of children from his exclusive private school clustered near the elaborate gift table, their designer clothes and practiced smiles as polished as their parents' small talk. Harlan watched them through lowered lashes, recognizing the careful distance they maintained. Not cruel exactly. Their parents had taught them better manners than outright mockery. But their kindness felt performative, like actors playing roles they didn't quite understand. "Should we go say happy birthday?" one girl whispered to her friend, loud enough for Harlan to hear. "Mom said we should be nice," came the response, followed by a pause that spoke volumes. "But he's so different." Different. The word hit him like a physical blow, even though he'd heard it whispered countless times before. Different because he couldn't walk. Different because he needed help reaching things. Different because his laugh came from a sitting position instead of standing height. The birthday boy adjusted his position in his wheelchair, the custom-made seat cushions doing little to ease the discomfort that came from hours of social performance. His legs, motionless beneath a hand-tailored blanket his mother had insisted upon to maintain dignity, might as well have been made of marble themselves. Across the room, his father held court near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked manicured gardens worth more than most people's entire homes. Donovan Clark commanded attention effortlessly, his silver-streaked hair and sharp suit projecting the kind of authority that built corporate empires. But when his gaze briefly found his son's, Harlan saw something that made his chest tighten, a flash of guilt so raw it was almost unbearable to witness. They both knew the truth that hung unspoken between them. The accident hadn't been random. It had been a Tuesday afternoon when Donovan, rushing between meetings, had made a choice that changed everything. Phone pressed to his ear, discussing merger details. He'd run the red light. The drunk driver who hit them had been at fault legally, but Harlan knew his father carried a different kind of guilt, the weight of divided attention in a moment that demanded complete focus. The irony wasn't lost on him. All this wealth, all this power, and his father still couldn't buy back the use of his son's legs. Couldn't purchase genuine friendship or erase the uncomfortable glances. Money, it turned out, was remarkably ineffective against the cruelest truths of human nature. As the minutes ticked by, the party continued around him like a well-choreographed performance. Servers in crisp uniforms circulated with champagne for the adults and sparkling cider for the children, their trained smiles never wavering as they navigated around his chair. The string quartet in the corner played classical pieces that echoed off the vaulted ceilings, creating a soundtrack for conversations he wasn't part of. Harlan's grip tightened on his toy car until his knuckles turned white. In his mind, he could still drive. In his dreams, he raced that little red vehicle down endless highways, his legs strong and sure on imaginary pedals. But here, in this gilded cage of birthday celebration, reality pressed down like a weight he couldn't escape. The candles on his cake continued to burn, wax beginning to drip onto the pristine white frosting. Soon, someone would notice and suggest he make a wish. But what did you wish for when you were surrounded by everything money could buy, yet had nothing you actually wanted? But what happened next would shatter every assumption about wealth, disability, and the true meaning of family. 3 hours earlier, Lancaster Technologies boardroom. Donovan Clark's voice cut through the mahogany-paneled conference room like a blade through silk. The Soul acquisition closes at midnight. I don't care if their lawyers need to pull an all-nighter. We're not losing this deal to indecision. 12 executives sat frozen around the polished table, their expensive suits unable to hide the nervous energy radiating from their bodies. When Donovan spoke, billion-dollar futures shifted. When he frowned, stock prices trembled. He was a man who had built an empire by reading people's weaknesses and exploiting them with surgical precision. Sir, ventured the youngest board member, his voice barely above a whisper, the regulatory concerns in Asia might require. Might? Donovan's steel-gray eyes locked onto the speaker with laser focus. I don't deal in might, Peterson. I deal in certainties. Either you have solutions, or I find someone who does. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of climate control and the distant sound of traffic 40 floors below. This was Donovan's domain, a world where problems could be solved with strategy, where obstacles were simply puzzles waiting for the right combination of pressure and resources. Here he was king. He could negotiate billion-dollar mergers with the finesse of a chess grandmaster. But he couldn't meet his son's eyes without seeing his own failure reflected back in devastating clarity. The irony burned through him as he dismissed the meeting with a sharp nod. In 90 minutes, he would need to transform from corporate predator to loving father, to slip on the mask of celebration and pretend that throwing money at his son's birthday could somehow compensate for the damage he'd caused. The damage that haunted his every waking moment. April 15th, 2019, 3:47 p.m. The call had come during school pickup. A potential investor from Dubai demanding immediate attention for a deal that could have added $40 million to the quarterly reports. Donovan had been behind the wheel of his Bentley. Harlan buckled safely in the passenger seat, chattering excitedly about a science project on renewable energy. Dad, did you know that solar panels can actually store energy even when it's cloudy? My teacher says. Hold on, son, Donovan had interrupted, pressing the phone to his ear. Ahmed, I understand your concerns, but the infrastructure costs you're worried about are completely manageable. The conversation consumed him completely. Numbers, projections, risk assessments, all the familiar territory where he felt most alive. He barely registered running the red light at Maple Street until the world exploded in a symphony of screeching metal and shattering glass. The drunk driver who T-boned them faced charges. The insurance companies fought over liability. The newspapers called it a tragic accident. But Donovan knew the truth that no court would ever hear. In the moment that mattered most, he had chosen business over his child's safety. Harlan had been unconscious for 6 days. When he finally opened his eyes in that sterile hospital room, the first thing he'd asked was whether his father was okay. Not about his own injuries. Not about the surgery that had revealed the devastating damage to his spine. He'd been worried about his dad. That memory could still drop Donovan to his knees. Now, standing in his corner office with its panoramic view of the city skyline, he stared at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows. Success surrounded him. Awards, photographs with world leaders, the tangible proof of his dominance in the corporate arena. But every achievement felt hollow when measured against the weight of his son's wheelchair. The overcompensation had started immediately. The best doctors, regardless of cost. A mansion retrofitted with every possible accommodation. Private tutors, specialized equipment, charitable donations to spinal injury research that ran into the millions, as if writing enough checks could somehow balance the cosmic ledger of his guilt. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Clark, your car is waiting. You should leave now to make it to the party on time." The party. Another exercise in expensive futility. Another attempt to buy happiness that remained stubbornly out of reach. Back at the estate. From Harlan's vantage point, the world looked fundamentally different. At 12 years old and confined to a wheelchair, his perspective was a landscape of belt buckles, purse straps, and carefully averted gazes. Adults towered above him like giants, their conversations floating over his head both literally and figuratively. He'd learned to read the subtle language of discomfort. The way people's steps faltered when they approached his chair. The pause before they spoke, as if searching their vocabulary for appropriate words. The relief in their voices when they could excuse themselves to refresh their drinks or greet someone across the room. "There's the birthday boy." Mrs. Henderson from his father's country club approached with the kind of exaggerated cheerfulness adults reserved for children they pitied. Her diamond bracelet caught the light as she bent down, bringing her face closer to his level. "Are you having a wonderful time, sweetheart?" The endearment stung. At 12, he was hardly a sweetheart, but his disability seemed to freeze him in amber at whatever age adults felt comfortable addressing. He managed a polite smile, the kind that had become his default expression at social gatherings. Near the elaborate chocolate fountain, he spotted 3 classmates from his private school. Marcus, whose father owned half the commercial real estate downtown. Jennifer, whose trust fund could probably fund a small country. And Sam, who'd been his best friend before the accident changed everything. They huddled together like a pack, occasionally glancing in his direction before quickly looking away. Their parents had positioned themselves strategically nearby, close enough to supervise, far enough to maintain plausible deniability about their children's behavior. "Go say happy birthday to Harlan," he heard Mrs. Whitmore whisper to Jennifer, giving her daughter a gentle push forward. Jennifer approached with the reluctance of someone walking to a dentist appointment. "Happy birthday, Harlan," she said dutifully, her voice carrying all the warmth of a prepared statement. "I hope you like your present." "Thank you," he replied, knowing she'd already forgotten which gift was from her family. They all blended together, expensive, age-appropriate, and somehow missing the mark completely. When she retreated to her friends, he caught the tail end of their whispered conversation. "My mom says we have to be nice because he can't help being, you know. It's so sad. I can't even look at him without feeling awful. Do you think it hurts, being stuck like that?" Their pity was worse than cruelty. At least cruelty was honest. This performative kindness, dispensed like medicine because adults had taught them it was the right thing to do, left him feeling more isolated than if they'd simply ignored him entirely. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the servers were clearing away half-eaten canapés, Harlan found himself truly alone for the first time all evening. The birthday cake sat before him, its candles still burning despite the late hour. Someone should have reminded him to make a wish by now, but the oversight felt symbolic. He closed his eyes and practiced the ritual anyway, the way he'd done alone in his bedroom for the past 3 years. "I wish," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible above the distant chatter. But the words wouldn't come. What did you wish for when you were surrounded by luxury but starved for genuine connection? When you had everything money could buy, but nothing your heart actually needed? He opened his eyes and stared at the flickering flames, watching the wax drip onto the pristine frosting. Each drop felt like another second ticking away in a life he hadn't chosen but was forced to inhabit. Every parent watching this knows the terror of failing the child they'd die to protect. But what happens when that failure isn't hypothetical, when it's carved into your child's spine and written across their future in permanent, irreversible ink? Donovan approached from behind, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. He paused just out of his son's peripheral vision, watching the boy he'd inadvertently broken sit alone with his untouched cake. The weight of 3 years' worth of guilt settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd conquered boardrooms and dominated markets, but he remained utterly powerless against the consequence of a single, devastating moment of divided attention. And as he watched his son practice making birthday wishes in solitude, Donovan realized that all his wealth couldn't buy the one thing they both needed most: forgiveness. The sound of approaching footsteps would soon change everything. But in this moment, father and son remained trapped in their respective prisons of guilt and isolation, separated by a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. Lydia Mercer's alarm clock screamed at 4:30 a.m. every morning, but she'd been awake for 20 minutes already, staring at the water stain on her apartment ceiling that looked suspiciously like a map of her failures. The coffee maker gurgled to life, a second-hand machine that took 10 minutes to produce something that barely qualified as coffee, but it was caffeine, and caffeine was survival. By 5:15, she was out the door for her first job cleaning office buildings downtown. By noon, she'd transitioned to her second job at the medical clinic, filing insurance claims and scheduling appointments. Evenings belonged to her third job, tutoring struggling students in math, because even exhausted, she could still make fractions make sense to frustrated teenagers. 3 jobs to afford Celeste speech therapy sessions. 3 jobs to keep their tiny apartment. 3 jobs to prove to herself that she wasn't the failure her ex-husband had claimed she was when he'd walked out 2 years ago, leaving behind only a forwarding address and a daughter who stopped talking for 6 months. "Mama, are you sad again?" 7-year-old Celeste appeared in the doorway, clutching her worn stuffed elephant, a garage sale find that had become her security blanket. The little girl's dark eyes held wisdom no child should possess, the kind that comes from watching a parent struggle and not understanding why the world had to be so hard. Celeste had been born with a processing delay that made words come slowly, thoughts tangling between her brain and her mouth like traffic in a construction zone. The therapy sessions were helping, but each appointment cost more than Lydia made in 2 days of cleaning toilets and emptying wastebaskets. "Not sad, baby," Lydia lied smoothly, pulling her daughter close for a hug that smelled like strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence. "Just thinking about our day." Their day. Friday afternoon meant accompanying Mrs. Chen, whose office building Lydia cleaned, to some fancy charity event. Mrs. Chen had mentioned needing someone to help with her coat and purse, a few extra hours of work disguised as kindness. The fact that it came with an invitation to stay for refreshments was an unexpected bonus. Lydia understood the real dynamic. Mrs. Chen felt guilty about paying poverty wages for backbreaking work, so occasionally she threw crumbs of inclusion that made her feel better about the inequality. But crumbs were still food, and Lydia had learned to swallow her pride along with whatever free meal came her way. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd be attending a birthday party for a rich kid, while her own daughter's upcoming birthday would consist of dollar store decorations and a homemade cake mixed from a box. But Celeste had been excited about getting dressed up, and Lydia couldn't bring herself to dampen that rare spark of joy. Her own childhood birthdays had taught her the art of making nothing feel like something. After her father left when she was 9, disappearing one Tuesday morning with promises to call that never materialized, birthdays became exercises in creative storytelling. Her mother, drowning in her own grief and financial panic, would forget until the last minute, then scramble to create celebration from whatever was in the cupboards. Lydia had promised herself that Celeste would never feel that particular brand of abandonment, even if it meant wearing the same dress to every social occasion and hoping nobody noticed the careful mending along the hem. 2 hours later, at the Clark estate, the contrast hit Lydia like a physical force. She'd cleaned wealthy people's offices, had scrubbed the toilets of luxury medical practices, but she'd never actually stood inside opulence like this. The estate's entrance hall rose 3 stories, topped by a skylight that sent rainbow prisms dancing across walls lined with paintings worth more than most people's houses. Her worn sneakers, the only comfortable shoes that could survive 12-hour workdays, squeaked softly against marble floors polished to mirror perfection. Every step echoed, announcing her presence to a room full of people whose shoes probably cost more than her monthly rent. Celeste's small hand tightened in hers, the little girl's eyes wide as she took in the overwhelming display of wealth. Servers in pristine uniforms glided between guests like dancers in a choreographed performance, balancing trays of food that looked more like art installations than actual sustenance. "Mama," Celeste whispered, her voice carrying the slight hesitation that marked her speech patterns. "Why is everything so shiny?" "Some people have more shiny things than others, sweetheart," Lydia replied quietly, feeling the weight of curious stares from nearby guests. She could read their expressions easily, the polite confusion of people trying to place her in their social hierarchy, the subtle way conversations paused as she passed. She'd worn her best dress, a navy blue thrift store find that had probably cost someone else $200 originally, but had cost her $12 3 months ago. She'd ironed it carefully, mended a small tear near the shoulder, and paired it with the only jewelry she owned, a simple silver necklace that had been her mother's. But no amount of preparation could disguise the fact that she didn't belong here. Her hands showed the calluses of real work. Her face bore the stress lines of someone who counted every penny and still came up short. She was a dandelion in a garden of orchids, hardy, resilient, but undeniably out of place. Mrs. Chen had disappeared into the crowd within minutes of arriving, leaving Lydia and Celeste to navigate the social landscape alone. They'd found refuge near a wall lined with bookshelves, where Celeste could marvel at leather-bound volumes while Lydia tried to blend into the background. That's when Celeste spotted him. "Mama," her daughter tugged at her dress with increasing urgency, her small voice carrying across the elegant space. "Mama, look." Following her daughter's gaze, Lydia's heart clenched at the sight of the boy sitting alone at an elaborate table. 12 years old, maybe 13, positioned in front of a birthday cake that belonged in a magazine spread. But it was his posture that stopped her breath, the careful way he held himself, as if trying to take up less space in the world. She recognized that posture, had worn it herself countless times growing up, sitting alone at her own kitchen table, while her mother worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. The way you learn to make yourself smaller when you realize nobody's coming to celebrate with you. "Mama," Celeste's whisper was urgent now, her words coming faster than usual in her distress. "That boy looks like I feel when the kids won't play with me at school. He looks lonely inside, like me when Daddy went away." The observation cut through Lydia like a blade. Her daughter, despite her own struggles with communication, had identified something the room full of adults had missed or chosen to ignore. This child, surrounded by luxury that most people could only dream of, was drowning in isolation. Lydia's first instinct was self-preservation. These weren't her people. This wasn't her world. Getting involved could only lead to embarrassment, to the kind of polite dismissal that reminded her exactly where she stood in the social order. Mrs. Chen might be mortified. Other guests might whisper about the cleaning lady who didn't know her place. But Celeste's hand in hers trembled with empathy, and Lydia remembered being 7 years old herself, watching other children get picked up from school by parents who smiled and asked about their day. She remembered the ache of being invisible, of sitting alone while life happened around her. "Should we?" Celeste started, then stopped, her processing delay making the words tangle. "Should we go make him not lonely?" The question hung between them like a bridge Lydia could either cross or burn. Every practical instinct screamed against it. These people lived in a different universe, one where her presence was tolerated only as long as she remained invisible, useful, forgettable. But her daughter's compassion blazed brighter than social anxiety. Celeste had learned loneliness early and recognized it in others with the wisdom of someone who'd survived it. And if Lydia had learned anything from her own childhood of abandonment, it was that sometimes a single person choosing to see you could change everything. She looked down at her worn sneakers against the pristine marble, took a breath that tasted like fear and hope in equal measure, and made her choice. "Yes, baby," she whispered back. "I think we should." The walk across that ballroom felt like crossing a continent. Every step echoed in the vast space, announcing their approach to anyone who cared to notice. Lydia felt the weight of dozens of eyes tracking their movement, heard the subtle shift in conversations as people registered this breach of social protocol. Her sneakers squeaked softly with each step, a sound that seemed to grow louder as they approached the boys' table. But Celeste's grip on her hand remained steady, her daughter's courage lending her strength she didn't know she possessed. The birthday boy looked up as they drew near, his eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been hope. In that moment, Lydia saw past the expensive clothes and elaborate setting to the universal truth that connected them. A child who needed to know he wasn't alone in the world. Take a moment right now to think about the lonely children in your own community. The ones sitting alone at lunch tables, the ones whose differences make others uncomfortable, the ones whose silence speaks volumes about their pain. Because recognizing them is the first step toward changing their world. Time moved like honey as Lydia approached the ornate table where Harlan sat in solitary vigil before his untouched cake. The ballroom's conversations didn't stop exactly, but they shifted. Voices lowering to whispers, champagne glasses pausing halfway to lips, curious gazes tracking the unexpected movement across the marble expanse. She could feel the weight of judgment pressing down like humidity before a storm. The unspoken rules of high society were being violated by her mere presence in this sacred space of wealth and privilege. A cleaning lady approaching the heir to a corporate empire wasn't just inappropriate, it was unthinkable. Mrs. Patterson, wife of the city's most prominent banker, actually took a small step backward, as if Lydia's working-class reality might somehow be contagious. The soft rustle of expensive silk dresses and the subtle clearing of throats created a soundtrack of discomfort that followed her across the room. But Celeste's small hand remained anchored in hers, warm and trusting, and that connection gave Lydia the strength to keep walking. Harlan's head lifted slowly as they drew near, his dark eyes reflecting a mixture of curiosity and wariness. For 3 years, adults had approached his chair with predetermined agendas. Doctors with their clinical assessments, teachers with their carefully modulated sympathy, family friends with their uncomfortable small talk designed to fill the space where genuine connection should have been. This was different. This woman moved without the cautious choreography of pity. Her worn sneakers against the pristine marble created an honest sound, real footsteps in a world of careful performances. "Hello," Lydia said softly when she reached the edge of his table, her voice carrying none of the exaggerated cheerfulness adults typically used with disabled children. She spoke to him as if he were simply another person, not a tragedy to be managed or a charity case to be endured. The simplicity of it stunned him. No elaborate introduction, no awkward dance around his disability, no performative kindness designed more for the speaker's comfort than his own. Just, hello, as if they were equals sharing a moment in time. "Hi," he managed, his voice rusty from disuse at his own party. Celeste peeked out from behind her mother's thrift store dress, her own struggle with words making her particularly attuned to the power of silence. She studied Harlan's face with the frank curiosity of childhood, seeing past the expensive clothes and elaborate setting to something more fundamental. "You look sad," she said finally, her words coming slowly but carrying absolute truth. "Like when I sit alone at lunch and watch other kids play games, I don't understand." The observation landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the nearby conversations. Adults shifted uncomfortably. Children weren't supposed to acknowledge these truths so directly. Social protocols demanded that they pretend not to notice, that they maintain the polite fiction that everything was perfectly fine. But Harlan felt something crack open in his chest, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. When was the last time someone had simply acknowledged his sadness without trying to fix it or explain it away? "I am sad," he admitted quietly, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "It's my birthday, but it doesn't feel very birthday-like." Celeste nodded with the solemn understanding of someone who'd experienced her own version of lonely celebrations. Birthdays aren't supposed to be lonely, right, Mama? They're supposed to be full of people who are happy you were born. The question hung in the air like a prayer, simple and profound. Lydia felt every eye in the room trained on their small tableau, felt the collective intake of breath as society's most powerful people waited to see how this unprecedented moment would resolve itself. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she looked down at Harlan, this boy who had everything money could provide, but nothing his soul actually needed. In his eyes, she saw her own childhood reflected back. The birthday candles blown out alone, the careful smile practiced in mirrors, the art of pretending that solitude was a choice rather than a sentence. The words came from somewhere deeper than thought, bypassing every logical reason to stay silent and invisible. "Would it be okay," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of revolution, "if we joined you?" The question detonated like a small bomb in the elegant space. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Crystal glasses froze halfway to painted lips. The very atoms in the air seemed to pause, waiting for the world to decide whether it would shift on its axis or return to its previous, predictable rotation. Donovan Clark, who had been monitoring the situation from across the room with increasing alarm, felt his corporate instincts scream for intervention. This was exactly the kind of unpredictable human element that made him uncomfortable, messy, uncontrolled, impossible to manage through strategy or negotiation. His first impulse was damage control. Approach with diplomatic smoothness, thank the woman for her concern, and redirect her attention elsewhere with the kind of polite dismissal that preserved everyone's dignity while maintaining proper social boundaries. He'd perfected the technique in countless boardroom situations where emotions threatened to disrupt carefully laid plans. But something in his son's expression stopped him cold. Harlan's face was transformed, lit from within by something Donovan hadn't seen in 3 years. Hope. Raw, desperate, beautiful hope that someone might actually want to share his space, not out of obligation or pity, but from genuine choice. "Yes," Harlan breathed, the word escaping like air from a punctured balloon. "Yes, please. I'd like that very much." Lydia pulled out the chair beside him, its leather seat probably worth more than her monthly rent, and settled Celeste across from them both. The formal place settings, crystal glasses arranged with mathematical precision, silver utensils polished to mirror brightness, suddenly seemed ridiculous in the face of this simple human triangle. "What's your favorite part of birthdays?" Celeste asked, settling into her seat with the natural ease of childhood. Her legs swung freely beneath the table, worn sneakers that matched her mother's, creating a rhythm against the chair legs. Harlan blinked, the question catching him off guard. When was the last time someone had asked him about his preferences, rather than simply telling him what he should enjoy? I used to like the singing," he admitted, his fingers unconsciously tightening around his battered toy car. "Before everything changed. My mom would sing really loud and off-key, and it made me laugh." "We could sing," Celeste offered with the straightforward problem-solving of a 7-year-old. "Mama knows all the words to Happy Birthday. She sings it to me even when it's not my birthday, just to practice for when it is." The suggestion rippled outward like water disturbed by a thrown stone. Other guests, who had been observing this breach of protocol with fascination and horror in equal measure, found themselves drawn closer, despite their better judgment. Mrs. Henderson, whose diamond bracelet had caught the light during her earlier uncomfortable interaction with Harlan, took a tentative step toward the table. Dr. Morrison, whose pharmaceutical company had sponsored half the charity events in the city, cleared his throat softly and moved within earshot. Even Mrs. Patterson, who had recoiled earlier, found herself leaning forward with reluctant curiosity. There was something magnetic about genuine emotion in a room that had been carefully curated to avoid it. These people lived in a world of managed experiences and predictable outcomes, where surprises were generally unwelcome and spontaneity was a luxury they couldn't afford. But watching this unlikely trio navigate their way toward connection awakened something dormant in their own carefully guarded hearts. "Should we really sing?" Lydia asked, her voice carrying just enough uncertainty to make the moment feel authentic rather than performative. "The candles are still burning," Harlan pointed out, and for the first time all evening his smile reached his eyes. It would be a shame to waste them. Celeste clapped her hands with delight, the sound sharp and joyful in the previously subdued atmosphere. On the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, their voices rose together, Lydia's warm alto, Celeste's clear soprano with its characteristic careful pacing, and Harlan's uncertain tenor that grew stronger with each word. The song was gloriously imperfect, beautifully human, completely at odds with the polished perfection of everything else in the room. Other voices began to join them, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Dr. Morrison's bass added depth to the harmony. Mrs. Henderson's trembling soprano added vulnerability. Even Mrs. Patterson, whose social radar had initially screamed warnings about this unprecedented moment, found herself humming along. The toy car in Harlan's grip relaxed from security blanket to conversation piece, as Celeste's eyes fixed on its chipped red paint with genuine interest. "Is that a race car?" she asked, when the last notes of the song faded into applause that felt spontaneous for the first time all evening. "It's a 1969 Mustang," Harlan replied, holding it out for her inspection. "My grandfather gave it to me before he died. He said it was the car he drove when he was young and foolish and in love." "It looks fast," Celeste said solemnly, accepting the precious object with the reverence it deserved, like it could drive anywhere in the whole world. "Anywhere," Harlan agreed, and something in his voice suggested they weren't talking about toy cars anymore. The formal boundary lines that had defined the evening began to dissolve as conversations bloomed around the table like flowers after rain. The untouchable birthday cake became the center of real celebration as plates appeared and slices were distributed with laughter instead of obligation. In that moment, a $50,000 birthday party became priceless. That night, 11:47 p.m. Donovan Clark sat in his study, staring at his phone as if it were a foreign object. The glowing screen displayed his assistant's contact information, cursor blinking over the call button that would connect him to the woman who managed his entire professional existence with military precision. In 15 years of building Lancaster Technologies into a global powerhouse, he had never once called in sick. Through food poisoning that left him doubled over in boardroom bathrooms, through the flu that made him shake during quarterly presentations, through the crushing migraines that followed 18-hour negotiation sessions, he had shown up, performed, conquered. But tonight, something fundamental had shifted in his carefully ordered universe. The image of Harlan's face during those 3 voices singing "Happy Birthday" played on an endless loop in his mind. The pure joy, the surprise, the way his son had looked at him afterward with something approaching forgiveness. It had cracked open a part of his soul he'd sealed shut 3 years ago. His finger hovered over the call button. Tomorrow's schedule blazed through his memory. 7 a.m. conference call with Tokyo investors, 10 a.m. presentation to the board of directors, 2 p.m. merger negotiations that could define the company's entire future direction. All of it felt suddenly, desperately insignificant. He pressed call. "Mr. Clark?" His assistant's voice carried professional alarm. Receiving calls from her boss after midnight usually meant crisis mode. "Is everything all right?" "Cancel tomorrow's meetings," he said quietly, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "All of them. Reschedule what you can, delegate what you can't. I won't be coming in." Silence stretched across the connection like a held breath. "Sir, are you ill?" Donovan looked through the study doorway toward the staircase that led to Harlan's room, where his son was probably lying awake replaying the evening's magic, afraid it might disappear with daylight. "No," he said finally. "For the first time in years, I think I'm getting well." The next morning, Harlan's eyes opened to sunlight streaming through windows he'd forgotten faced east. For a moment, the previous evening felt like a dream. Too perfect, too transformative to have actually happened in his carefully controlled world of managed disappointments. But then he heard something that made him sit up with startled recognition. His father's voice, not sharp with business urgency, but soft with something that sounded almost like vulnerability. "Good morning, son." Donovan stood in the doorway, wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt instead of his usual armor of expensive suits. His hair, normally styled with mathematical precision, fell across his forehead in a way that made him look younger, more human. "Dad?" Harlan's voice carried confusion. "Shouldn't you be at work?" "I called in sick." The admission came with a sheepish smile that transformed Donovan's entire face. First time in 15 years, figured it was about time. They sat together on Harlan's bed, father and son, in a space that had been carefully designed for every medical need, but had somehow missed the most important requirement: room for honest conversation. "Harlan," Donovan began, his voice catching slightly, "I need to tell you something about the accident, something I should have said 3 years ago." The words hung between them like a bridge. Harlan had been waiting to cross his entire recovery. He'd known, on some level, that his father carried guilt about that day. But they'd never spoken about it directly, both of them trapped in their respective silences. "It was my fault," Donovan continued, each word seeming to cost him something vital. "Not legally, not officially, but I was on the phone, a business call that seemed so important at the time. If I'd been paying attention, if I'd seen that red light." "Dad," Harlan's voice was steady, older than his 12 years. "I know." The simple acknowledgement broke something open in Donovan's chest. "You know?" "I've always known. I remember the call. Remember you talking about numbers and contracts while I was trying to tell you about my science project." Harlan reached for his father's hand, the gesture awkward but determined. "But Dad, the drunk driver hit us. That wasn't your fault." "But if you'd been perfect?" Harlan interrupted with a wisdom that startled them both. "Dad, nobody's perfect. Not even CEOs." The conversation lasted until noon. 3 years of buried grief and guilt finally given voice in the safety of a bedroom where medical equipment had been joined by the more powerful medicine of truth. 2 weeks later, Lydia's phone buzzed with a text that made her smile despite the exhaustion of another triple shift day. Harlan asks if Celeste wants to come over Saturday. He's excited to show her his train collection. Donovan. The friendship that had bloomed between their children was unlike anything either parent had expected. Not the careful, supervised interactions typical of Harlan's social calendar, but genuine connection built on shared understanding of what it felt like to be different. Celeste's speech delays and Harlan's physical limitations became launching pads for creativity rather than barriers to overcome. They invented games that worked for both of them, created stories where differences were superpowers, built a friendship that existed outside the usual childhood hierarchies of ability and status. "Mama," Celeste announced after their third play date, "Harlan says his dad is learning to be better at being a dad, like how I'm learning to be better at words." The observation carried profound truth. Donovan was learning, awkwardly, imperfectly, but with determination that reminded Lydia of her own journey towards single motherhood. They'd begun sharing parenting insights across the vast divide of their economic circumstances, discovering that love and uncertainty translated across all social boundaries. Channel 7 News, 3 weeks later. Tonight at 11, we bring you a story that's captured hearts across our community. Not because of wealth or status, but because of a simple act of kindness that's creating waves of change throughout our city. The reporter, Sarah Martinez, had initially been assigned to cover the Clark Estate's charity fundraiser, a standard puff piece about rich people doing good deeds. But the story she'd uncovered was far more compelling. What started as one woman asking, "Can we join you?" has grown into something much larger. Local schools are reporting increased awareness of inclusive practices. Community centers are hosting friendship circles designed to connect children who might otherwise remain isolated. The news piece featured interviews with Mrs. Henderson, who admitted that watching Lydia's courage had inspired her to volunteer at a special needs summer camp. Dr. Morrison spoke about implementing accessibility reviews across all his company's facilities. But the most powerful moment came when they showed Harlan and Celeste together, the boy who'd sat alone at his birthday cake, now surrounded by friends who saw his wheelchair as just another part of who he was. Lancaster Technologies boardroom, 1 month later. Effective immediately. Lancaster Technologies will be implementing comprehensive accessibility initiatives across all our facilities. Donovan announced to a boardroom full of executives who were still adjusting to their CEO's transformed leadership style. The changes weren't just physical, ramps and elevator access and modified workstations. They were cultural, designed to create an environment where differences were valued rather than merely accommodated. Additionally, we'll be partnering with local special needs organizations to create internship programs and mentorship opportunities. Because I've learned that diversity isn't good policy, it's essential for innovation. The ripple effects extended far beyond corporate boardrooms. Other companies began examining their own practices, inspired by Lancaster Technologies' public commitment to inclusion. The local Chamber of Commerce launched a citywide accessibility initiative. Harlan School, 6 weeks later. The transformation in Harlan's confidence was visible from the moment he rolled through the school's front doors. Where before he'd navigated hallways with the careful invisibility of someone trying not to be noticed, now he moved with purpose, engagement, genuine connection to his environment. It started with small changes. Sitting with other students at lunch instead of eating alone. Volunteering to present his science projects instead of accepting the teacher's offer to skip public speaking. Joining the chess club, where his strategic mind could shine regardless of his physical limitations. But the real magic happened when other students began following Celeste's lead in simply treating differences as facts rather than barriers. Marcus, whose father owned half the commercial real estate downtown, asked genuine questions about how Harlan's wheelchair worked. Jennifer, whose trust fund could fund small countries, invited him to her skating party and worked with the venue to ensure accessibility. The change wasn't universal. Some students and parents still carried their discomfort like invisible shields. But enough hearts had been opened to create a new social dynamic where inclusion felt natural rather than forced. Remember this. Every small act of reaching out, every moment of choosing connection over comfort, every time you ask, "Can I join you?" instead of walking past someone who's alone, these moments create ripples that extend far beyond what you can see. In your own community, in your own daily life, there are children sitting alone who are waiting for someone to notice. There are parents struggling in isolation who need to know they're not the only ones fighting these battles. There are opportunities every single day to be the person who changes someone's entire trajectory with a simple act of inclusion. The story of Harlan and Lydia proves that transformation doesn't require wealth or power. It requires courage. The courage to cross social boundaries, to risk awkwardness, to choose empathy over indifference. But the revolution was just beginning. 3 months after the birthday, the friendship between Celeste and Harlan defied every social convention their respective worlds had taught them to expect. In Harlan's mansion, where Persian rugs had once muffled the sound of his isolation, their laughter now echoed through hallways that had forgotten the music of childhood joy. They were an unlikely pair, the CEO's son whose medical needs cost more per month than most families' annual income, and the cleaning lady's daughter, whose speech came in careful, measured phrases that required patience to fully understand. But in each other, they'd found something neither had experienced before: complete acceptance. "Watch this," Celeste announced, positioning herself at the top of the mansion's main staircase. She discovered that sliding down the banister was infinitely more entertaining than walking down the steps like a proper young lady. "Be careful," Harlan called from below, his voice carrying the protective concern of someone who understood physical vulnerability. That marble floor doesn't forgive mistakes. But his warning came with a smile, not the anxious hovering that adults usually brought to his world. With Celeste, he could express worry without being treated as fragile himself. She respected his perspective on safety because it came from experience, not pity. Their games evolved around their combined limitations and strengths. They created elaborate race courses where Harlan's wheelchair became an advantage rather than a barrier, navigating obstacles while Celeste provided commentary in her distinctive, deliberate speech pattern. They invented stories where differences were secret powers, where the girl who thought slowly could see truths others missed, where the boy who couldn't walk could fly in dreams. "Harlan," Celeste said one afternoon as they worked together on a puzzle in the mansion's sunroom, "do you think we're friends because we're both different, or despite being different?" The question stopped him mid-piece placement. At 9 years old, she possessed a philosophical depth that often caught adults off guard. "I think," he said carefully, "we're friends because we understand what different feels like. But that's not the only reason." "What's the other reason?" "You make me laugh," he admitted. "Real laughs, not the polite ones I do at parties, and you listen to my ideas like they matter." "They do matter," she replied with the matter-of-fact certainty that made her special. "All ideas matter. That's what Mama says." Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Lydia and Donovan's unlikely alliance had begun awkwardly, built on shared coffee and tentative conversations about parenting in a world that didn't quite know how to handle their children. But necessity had forged understanding that transcended their vastly different economic realities. "She's been having nightmares again," Lydia confided, wrapping her hands around a mug that probably cost more than her weekly grocery budget. "About kids at school laughing at her speech. I don't know how to help her build confidence without lying about how cruel people can be." Donovan nodded, recognizing the impossible balance every parent of a different child had to strike. "Harlan asks me if he'll ever have real friends, or if people will always see the wheelchair first. I want to promise him it gets easier, but—" He trailed off, honesty more valuable than false comfort. "But we don't actually know if it does get easier," Lydia finished. "We just hope we're giving them enough strength to handle whatever comes." These conversations happened in spaces throughout the mansion that Donovan was slowly learning to navigate differently. The formal dining room where business associates had once sealed deals over expensive wine now hosted tea parties where the most important negotiations involved whether the stuffed animals got the good seats. The library, previously a showcase for leather-bound first editions, had been transformed into an accessible homework space where Harlan could reach every book, and Celeste could spread her art projects across surfaces without worrying about damaging priceless furniture. Most significantly, Donovan had begun learning about universal design, not just accommodating Harlan's wheelchair, but creating spaces that worked for everyone, ramps that looked like natural landscape features instead of medical afterthoughts. Doorways widened with architectural grace rather than obvious modification. Bathrooms that felt luxurious rather than clinical. "I never realized," he admitted to Lydia during one of their planning sessions, "how many barriers I'd built into my own home without thinking about it." "Most people don't," she replied gently. "Until someone you love needs something different, you just don't see it." The resistance. Not everyone in their respective social circles embraced this unlikely alliance. At the country club, whispered conversations followed Donovan like shadows. "It's admirable, of course, helping that woman and her daughter," Mrs. Whitmore murmured to her tennis partner, her voice carrying the practiced diplomacy of someone delivering criticism disguised as concern. "But one has to wonder about appropriate boundaries." "Exactly," Mrs. Patterson agreed, her own discomfort from the birthday party still coloring her perspective. "What message does it send, really, that success comes with obligations to, well, to people who make different choices?" The implication was clear. Lydia's poverty was somehow a choice, a moral failing that should inspire charity but not genuine relationship. Donovan felt the familiar burn of corporate anger at their willful ignorance. But he'd learned that defending Lydia's dignity required strategic thinking rather than emotional reaction. "Lydia works 3 jobs to afford her daughter's therapy," he said quietly at the next board meeting when similar sentiments emerged. "She's shown me more about genuine work ethic and sacrifice than most people in this room ever will. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps the problem isn't with her." Lydia's internal struggle. The mansion's opulence still took Lydia's breath away every time she walked through its doors. Crystal chandeliers that cost more than her annual salary, artwork that belonged in museums, casual luxuries that represented lifetimes of her labor. Some days, the inequality felt overwhelming. She'd catch her reflection in a mirror surrounded by gold leaf and wonder what she was doing in this world, whether her presence was somehow damaging to Celeste's understanding of their real place in society. "Mama," Celeste said one evening as they walked to their modest car parked behind Donovan's fleet of luxury vehicles, "are we poor?" The question hit like a physical blow. "We have everything we need, baby. Love, health, each other. That makes us rich in the ways that matter. But Harlan's house is so big, and ours is so small." Lydia knelt beside her daughter, searching for words that honored truth without breeding resentment. "Different families have different amounts of money, sweetheart. But friendship isn't about how much money you have. It's about how much you care. So Harlan cares about me even though we don't have fancy things?" "Especially because you don't need fancy things to be wonderful," Lydia confirmed, wondering if she was convincing her daughter or herself. Harlan's transformation. The boy who had once practiced birthday wishes in solitude was becoming something his father barely recognized: an advocate, a leader, a young person who used his platform for purposes beyond comfort. It started small, speaking up when classmates made thoughtless comments about disabilities, volunteering to help new students who seemed overwhelmed or isolated, using his family's influence to suggest accessibility improvements at school events. But then Harlan proposed something that surprised everyone: a disability awareness club that would educate students about inclusion while creating genuine friendships across different abilities. "I want kids to understand that wheelchairs aren't scary," he explained to the school principal, his confidence growing with each word. "And I want kids with disabilities to know they're not alone. Celeste taught me that different doesn't mean less than. I want to teach other people that too." The club's first meeting drew 12 students. Within 6 weeks, it had 40 members and a waiting list. They hosted assemblies, organized inclusive activities, and most importantly, created a social environment where differences were celebrated rather than merely tolerated. "You should be proud," Lydia told Donovan, as they watched Harlan lead a discussion about accessible code playground design. "He's becoming exactly the kind of leader the world needs." "We should be proud," Donovan corrected. "This transformation happened because our children found each other, because you had the courage to ask if you could join him. Now it's your turn to reflect. Have you ever been the person who approached someone sitting alone? Have you ever been the one who needed someone to notice your isolation? Share in the comments below your own experiences with inclusion, with reaching across social barriers, with the moment when someone's simple kindness changed your perspective. Because every story of connection creates a map for others to follow, and your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. 1 year later, Harlan's 13th birthday. The same crystal chandelier cast its light across the Clark Estate's grand ballroom, but the energy underneath it had transformed completely. Where 12 months ago silence had pressed down like a weight, now laughter bubbled up from every corner of the room like a natural spring. The guest list read like a social experiment that had somehow worked beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Mrs. Henderson, dripping in diamonds, stood deep in conversation with Maria Santos, Lydia's co-worker from the medical clinic, discussing the merits of different physical therapy approaches with the passion of two mothers who'd navigated similar challenges. Dr. Morrison, whose pharmaceutical empire had initially made him view disability as a problem to be solved, now listened intently as James Tucker, a maintenance worker from Lydia's apartment complex who happened to be a Paralympic swimmer, explained the nuanced differences between adaptation and accommodation. The transformation wasn't just in the guest list. The entire estate had been redesigned with universal access in mind, but so thoughtfully that visitors might not immediately notice the changes. Gentle ramps flowed like natural landscape features into the main entrance. Doorways had been widened with architectural grace that enhanced rather than compromised the mansion's elegance. Even the lighting had been adjusted to accommodate various visual needs without sacrificing ambiance. Celeste, now 8 and growing more confident with each passing month, moved through the crowd like a natural diplomat. Her speech, still deliberate and carefully paced, carried newfound authority as she introduced Harlan's new friends from the Disability Awareness Club to her mother's colleagues from the various worlds of working-class life. "This is Marcus," she announced to a group that included both the city's premier banker and a single father who drove delivery trucks for a living. He uses a communication device because talking with his voice is harder than talking with technology, but his ideas are really, really good. Marcus beamed, his tablet ready with pre-programmed responses, but his eyes bright with the confidence of someone who'd learned his voice mattered regardless of how it emerged. The mixed group leaned in with genuine interest, their initial awkwardness dissolved by Celeste's matter-of-fact acceptance. Near the elaborate gift table, still expensive but now mixed with handmade items that carried far more emotional weight than their monetary value, Harlan held court in his wheelchair, no longer positioned as a tragic figure to be pitied, but as the evening's central celebrant. The same toy car sat on the table beside him, but its context had completely changed. No longer clutched in isolation like a security blanket, it had become a conversation starter, a bridge between his past and present. Celeste had painted tiny racing stripes on its faded surface, and other children from the Disability Club had added their own small modifications: stickers, miniature flags, evidence of shared ownership and collective joy. Last year, Harlan said to a cluster of friends both old and new, "This car was the only thing that understood me." Now, he gestured around the room filled with genuine connections. "Now I understand that understanding comes from people willing to try." As the evening progressed toward the traditional cake ceremony, Donovan approached the microphone that had been set up near the same table where his son had sat alone 12 months earlier. The ballroom gradually quieted, conversations winding down as attention focused forward. "A year ago," Donovan began, his voice carrying both vulnerability and strength, "my son sat alone at his birthday cake in a room full of people. I thought I was giving him everything: the best food, the most elaborate decorations, the most expensive entertainment. But I was wrong about what everything meant." His gaze found Lydia in the crowd, standing with her arm around Celeste, both of them wearing dresses that were still clearly secondhand, but somehow seemed perfectly appropriate in this transformed space. A woman I barely knew had the courage to approach that table and ask a simple question: "Can we join you?" Those 5 words didn't just change my son's birthday. They changed our entire understanding of what family means, what community means, what wealth actually looks like when it's measured in human connection rather than bank accounts. Applause rippled through the room, but Donovan raised his hand gently, indicating he wasn't finished. Which brings me to tonight's announcement. Harlan and I have been working with Lydia and Celeste to establish something we're calling the Clark Mercer Inclusion Initiative. It's a foundation designed to create exactly what happened in this room. Spaces where differences are celebrated, where barriers are removed, not just physically but socially, where every child gets to experience what it feels like to have someone choose to sit beside them. The room erupted in genuine applause, but Harlan was already wheeling toward the microphone, his confidence evident in every movement. "I want to say something too," he announced, his voice strong and clear. "Last year, I was surrounded by expensive things but starving for real friendship. Tonight, I'm surrounded by the richest thing in the world: people who show up not because they have to, but because they want to." His eyes found Lydia's in the crowd. "To the woman who taught me that family isn't about blood or money, but about showing up when someone needs you to show up. Thank you for asking if you could join me. Thank you for bringing Celeste, who taught me that different doesn't mean less than. Thank you for showing my dad and me that wealth without connection is just expensive loneliness." The birthday cake, still elaborate but now surrounded by a crowd that felt like genuine community rather than social obligation, flickered with 13 candles that seemed to burn brighter in the presence of authentic celebration. As voices rose together in the familiar song, the harmony was still imperfect, still beautifully human. But now it carried layers of meaning that transcended the simple melody. Mrs. Henderson's trembling soprano mixed with Maria Santos's confident alto. Dr. Morrison's bass blended with James Tucker's tenor. Corporate executives and maintenance workers, special needs teachers, and pharmaceutical researchers, all contributing their voices to a moment that proved transformation was possible when people chose connection over comfort. The same crystal chandelier that had once illuminated isolation now cast its light on something far more valuable than anything money could purchase. A community built on the radical idea that everyone deserves to have someone choose to sit beside them. In that moment, watching his son blow out candles surrounded by friends who saw his wheelchair as just one interesting part of who he was, Donovan understood what true wealth looked like. And it had nothing to do with the fortune in his bank accounts. 3 years later, at 16, Harlan Clark commanded attention in ways that had nothing to do with his father's wealth and everything to do with his own earned authority. The boy who had once hidden behind a toy car now testified for state legislative committees about accessibility rights, his wheelchair positioned not as a symbol of limitation, but as evidence of his expertise in navigating a world that still had much to learn. Inclusion isn't charity, he told a packed auditorium at the National Disability Rights Conference, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had discovered his purpose. It's not about feeling sorry for people who are different. It's about recognizing that different perspectives make every community stronger. The standing ovation that followed came from advocates who saw in him something precious, a young leader who had transformed personal struggle into public service, who refused to let his disability define his limits, but used his platform to expand possibilities for others. His wheelchair had become what it always should have been, simply the way he moved through the world, no more remarkable than someone else's choice of shoes. What people noticed now was his sharp intellect, his natural ability to build bridges between opposing viewpoints, his gift for making complex policy discussions accessible to everyone in the room. Across town, Celeste Mercer, now 11 and completing her first year of middle school, had found her calling in ways that surprised everyone except her mother. The girl whose own speech delays had once made communication challenging was now the most sought-after peer tutor in her school district. She has this gift, her supervising teacher explained to visiting educators. She understands exactly what it feels like to struggle with words, to have thoughts that move faster than your ability to express them. But instead of just empathizing, she's learned to translate that understanding into practical help. Celeste's tutoring sessions had become legendary among students with learning differences. She never made anyone feel broken or less than. Instead, she helped them discover their own unique ways of processing information, their own strengths that traditional education systems sometimes missed. "I want to be a special needs teacher," she announced at her own birthday party, a modest celebration in their still small apartment that somehow felt richer than any mansion gathering. Because everyone deserves to have someone who believes they're smart in their own way. Her path was already clear: education degree, special needs certification, and a future spent asking her own version of "Can I join you?" to students who felt isolated by their differences. In the corporate world, Donovan Clark's transformation had rippled through the business community in ways that surprised even him. Lancaster Technologies had become a model for inclusive employment practices, not through forced compliance, but through genuine culture change that started at the top. "Profit matters," he told the Chamber of Commerce during his keynote speech about corporate social responsibility. "But profit without purpose is just numbers on a balance sheet. When you create an environment where everyone can contribute their best work, when you remove barriers that have nothing to do with actual job requirements, you don't just do the right thing, you unlock innovation you never knew existed." The company's disability inclusion programs had become so successful that other corporations sent delegations to study their methods. Not because it was good public relations, but because inclusive workplaces consistently outperformed homogeneous ones in creativity, problem-solving, and employee satisfaction. Donovan still worked hard, still closed important deals, still built shareholder value. But he'd learned to measure success differently, to understand that true leadership meant creating opportunities for others to succeed alongside him. The heart of it all. Lydia Mercer had discovered something powerful about her own voice in the years since that transformative birthday party. The woman who had once cleaned office buildings in invisible silence had become a community organizer whose simple question, "Can I join you?" had evolved into a movement. She'd started small, noticing lonely kids at Celeste's school events and facilitating connections. But her work had expanded to encompass senior citizens sitting alone in community centers, new immigrants navigating unfamiliar social landscapes, families dealing with disabilities who felt isolated from their neighborhoods. The thing about loneliness, she told a gathering of social workers, is that it's everywhere, but we've been trained not to see it. Once you start looking, once you start asking if you can join people instead of waiting for invitations, you realize how many beautiful connections are just waiting to happen. Still working, still struggling financially, still navigating the challenges of single parenthood, but now doing it as part of a community she'd helped build. One conversation at a time. The universal truth. Their story had taught them something profound. Revolution doesn't always announce itself with grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Sometimes it begins with something as simple as a mother and daughter approaching a lonely child and asking if they can sit down. That question, "Can we join you?" had become more than words. It had become a philosophy, a way of moving through the world that prioritized connection over comfort, inclusion over tradition, love over fear. Sometimes the most powerful question in the world is the simplest one. Not what can I get, but what can I give? Not how can I protect myself, but how can I reach out? Not why should I care, but how can I help? Every person reading this story, every viewer watching this video, has the power to be someone's Lydia. You have the ability to notice the Harlans in your world, the kids sitting alone at lunch tables, the elderly neighbors who rarely see visitors, the coworkers who eat at their desks because they assume no one wants their company. Your voice asking, "Can I join you?" might be the most important sound someone hears all day. Your willingness to cross social boundaries, to risk awkwardness, to choose inclusion over indifference, could literally change someone's life trajectory. So here's your challenge. This week, look for someone sitting alone, at work, at school, in your neighborhood, at community events. Someone whose difference makes others uncomfortable, whose isolation has become invisible to everyone else. Walk across that room. Ask that simple question. Join them. Because the next time you see someone sitting alone, remember Harlan's story. Remember that your simple, "Can I join you?" might just save someone's life. The revolution is waiting, and it starts with you.